Caroline Pearson had always been exceptional at managing situations, and Wesley's presence at Natalie's wedding was definitely a situation that needed managing. She'd spent months orchestrating every detail of this day, carefully curating the guest list to reflect the kind of family the Colemans expected their son to marry into. The kind of family that summered in Newport Beach, not the kind where the stepfather showed up with concrete dust still embedded in his fingernails. Standing at the entrance of Riverside Country Club, watching the hostess scroll through her tablet with that perfectly practiced confusion, Caroline felt a familiar surge of control washing over her. This was exactly why she'd handled the guest arrangements personally, why she'd told Natalie that Mom would take care of the family logistics. Some decisions were too important to leave to sentiment. Wesley stood beside her, tugging at his tie like it was strangling him, which, in Caroline's carefully calculated opinion, it might as well have been. 28 years of construction work had left its mark on him in ways that no amount of dry cleaning could erase. The calloused hands, the slightly hunched shoulders from years of leaning over blueprints, the way he automatically checked his pocket for his measuring tape, even when wearing a suit. All charming in their own way, she supposed, but not exactly what Vincent and Jennifer Coleman had in mind when they pictured their daughter-in-law's family. The hostess looked up with that apologetic smile Caroline had seen 1,000 times in her real estate career. The smile that said, "We have a problem, but we're going to handle it professionally." "I'm not seeing Mr. Pearson on the guest list," she said, and Caroline had to suppress the tiny thrill of satisfaction that ran through her. Perfect execution. She'd spent weeks perfecting this moment, actually. The guest list had gone through 7 revisions, each one more refined than the last. Wesley's name had been there initially, of course, buried on page 3 between her cousin from San Diego and Natalie's old high school teacher. But as the responses came in, as she saw the impressive collection of surnames that would be gathered under one roof, Coleman tech executives, Newport Beach social circle families, country club board members, Wesley's entry began to feel increasingly out of place. The removal had been surgical. A phone call to the event coordinator, framed as a small adjustment to accommodate some last-minute VIP additions from the groom's side. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would raise questions. Just Caroline being Caroline, managing details with her characteristic efficiency. The kind of efficiency that had made her one of the top real estate agents in Riverside County. The kind that knew exactly how to present properties to appeal to the right demographic. Watching Wesley's face as the reality settled in, Caroline felt that same professional satisfaction she experienced when closing a difficult sale. His expression shifted through the predictable stages: confusion, embarrassment, that particular hurt that men tried so hard to mask with dignity. She'd seen it before, that moment when someone realized they didn't quite fit into the picture they thought they belonged in. "How?" Wesley whispered, and Caroline squeezed his sleeve with just the right amount of supportive pressure. Not too much, that would suggest she was surprised too. Just enough to show appropriate wifely concern, while subtly encouraging him toward the inevitable conclusion. The conclusion that making a scene would only make things worse, that the graceful thing to do would be to step back and let the day proceed smoothly. Behind them, Caroline could sense the growing awareness of their situation. The subtle shift in conversation volume, the way peripheral guests began to notice the small drama playing out at the entrance. This was the delicate part, the moment that required her most careful management. Too much protest from Wesley, and the situation could spiral into the kind of embarrassing spectacle that would overshadow Natalie's entire day. Too little resistance, and he might not fully internalize the lesson she was trying to teach him. "Go around to the service entrance," she murmured to him, the words carefully chosen. Not "wait in the car" or "go home." That would be too obviously dismissive. The service entrance suggestion implied a solution, a way for him to salvage some dignity while still acknowledging his proper place in the hierarchy of this event. It was, she reflected, rather generous of her. The brilliant thing about Wesley was his predictability. 28 years of following building codes and union protocols had trained him to accept authority structures, to find workarounds rather than confrontations. He would smile that resigned smile, make some self-deprecating comment about not wanting, to hold up the line and quietly remove himself from the situation, just like he did when her book club friends came over and he retreated to the garage, just like he did at company parties when the conversation turned to wine tastings or European vacations he couldn't contribute to meaningfully. As she watched him walk away, shoulders straight, maintaining that stubborn dignity that was both admirable and slightly pathetic, Caroline felt the last piece of her carefully constructed day falling into place. Inside, the string quartet was warming up. The Colemans were probably already networking with the other influential families, and Natalie was about to marry into exactly the kind of life Caroline had always envisioned for her daughter. Wesley's truck rumbled to life in the parking lot, that distinctive sound of American-made machinery that had once seemed so appealingly masculine but now felt embarrassingly blue-collar. Caroline didn't watch him drive away. She was already turning toward the entrance, already shifting into the gracious mother-of-the-bride role she'd rehearsed so carefully, already preparing to navigate the delicate social waters that lay ahead. The hostess cleared her throat gently. "Shall we proceed with check-in, Mrs. Pearson?" Caroline smiled, the radiant smile that had sold million-dollar properties and charmed country club membership committees. "Of course," she said, smoothing her lavender dress. "Let's not keep anyone waiting." After all, some things were more important than hurt feelings. The reception was proceeding flawlessly, exactly as Caroline had orchestrated. The Colemans moved through the crowd with that effortless grace that came from generations of country club memberships and charitable board positions. Vincent Coleman had already introduced her to 3 potential clients, families relocating from Silicon Valley with 8-figure budgets, and Jennifer Coleman had mentioned the possibility of Caroline joining their upcoming charity auction committee. Everything was falling into place with the precision of a real estate closing. Natalie looked radiant at the head table, her smile bright enough to deflect any questions about the minor hiccup at check-in. Marshall kept his hand protectively on her back, the perfect attentive husband, exactly the kind of match Caroline had hoped for since Natalie started dating seriously. Software sales provided stability without the blue-collar limitations that had defined Caroline's own choices 16 years ago. The absence of Wesley's beat-up Silverado from the valet area was a relief Caroline hadn't fully anticipated. She'd grown so accustomed to making excuses for it: the rust spot near the tailgate, the contractor's ladder rack that screamed "working man" to anyone within a 50-foot radius. Tonight, the parking area was a showcase of luxury sedans and SUVs, the kind of automotive display that reinforced the social caliber she'd carefully cultivated for this event. During the cocktail hour, Caroline found herself in exactly the conversation she'd been preparing for. Jennifer Coleman had cornered her near the bar, wine glass in hand, with that particular smile wealthy women used when conducting social reconnaissance. "So, tell me about your family, Caroline. I feel like we barely scratched the surface during the engagement party." This was it. The moment Caroline had been refining in her mind for months. "Well, it's really just Natalie and me," she said with practiced ease. "My first marriage ended when Natalie was quite young. I've been so focused on her education and development since then." Technically true, if you didn't count the 16 years she'd spent married to Wesley. But truth, Caroline had learned in real estate, was often about emphasis and omission. "No extended family?" Jennifer pressed, with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting complete information. "The guest list seemed quite intimate on your side." Caroline sipped her wine, buying herself a moment. "I believe in quality over quantity," she replied. "I'd rather celebrate with people who truly understand what this day means." The subtext was clear enough. She'd curated her guest list to exclude anyone who might diminish the tone she was trying to establish. The conversation drifted towards safer territory: vacation destinations, school districts, the challenges of raising children in an increasingly complex world. But Caroline could sense Jennifer filing away the information about her intimate family situation. In the Coleman social circle, family background mattered, pedigree was currency, and Caroline had just effectively declared herself self-made rather than encumbered by inconvenient relatives. As the evening progressed, Caroline noticed how seamlessly she moved through the crowd without Wesley's gravitational pull. At their usual social events, she found herself constantly managing his interactions, steering conversations away from topics that might highlight their different backgrounds, making excuses when he couldn't contribute meaningfully to discussions about wine regions or private school admissions. Tonight, she was free to be simply herself, Caroline Pearson, successful realtor, devoted mother, elegant woman who clearly belonged in these circles. The irony wasn't lost on her that Wesley's name was printed on virtually every vendor contract and invoice related to this event. He'd insisted on handling the financial arrangements with that methodical attention to detail that made him excellent at construction management, but occasionally tedious in domestic situations. She had been happy to let him write the checks, sign the guarantor forms, handle all the mundane paperwork, while she focused on the more sophisticated aspects of wedding planning. But signatures on contracts and presents at celebrations were entirely different matters. Wesley might have the legal responsibility for this event, but Caroline had the social responsibility for its success. And success, in her carefully considered opinion, sometimes required difficult choices about inclusion and presentation. Her phone buzzed discreetly against her evening clutch. A text message, probably from Wesley, undoubtedly asking when he should return, or expressing some form of confusion about the guest list situation. She let it sit unread. Whatever emotional processing he needed to do could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was about Natalie's future, about the connections being formed, about the foundation being laid for the kind of life Caroline had always envisioned for her daughter. The band was setting up for dancing when Caroline spotted Donovan Wells across the room. He'd been one of Wesley's commercial clients, she remembered. Something about an office renovation that had gone particularly well. Donovan was chatting with Vincent Coleman near the bar, their conversation, animated and clearly professional in nature. For a split second, Caroline felt a flicker of anxiety. Had Wesley mentioned the project details? Would Donovan bring up her husband's construction work? But Donovan merely nodded politely when their eyes met across the room, offering the kind of distant recognition appropriate for social acquaintances. No questions about Wesley's absence, no awkward inquiries about the family business. The evening's careful orchestration was holding beautifully. As Caroline moved through the reception, accepting congratulations and compliments on the wedding's elegance, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with maternal pride and everything to do with strategic execution. She'd navigated the complex social dynamics flawlessly, positioned herself and Natalie within exactly the right circles, and managed to avoid any complications that might have undermined the evening's sophisticated tone. Wesley's absence had stopped feeling like a problem and started feeling like a solution. Monday morning arrived with a sense of completion Caroline hadn't experienced since closing her first $1 million listing. The wedding had been absolutely perfect. Jennifer Coleman had already texted about the charity committee position. 2 potential clients had scheduled consultations for later in the week, and Natalie had sent a glowing photo from her honeymoon suite overlooking Catalina Island. Everything had proceeded exactly according to Caroline's carefully laid plans, which made the phone call from Riverside Country Club's event coordinator completely bewildering. "Mrs. Pearson," the woman said, her voice carrying that particular tension that Caroline recognized from her real estate career as the prelude to expensive complications. "We've received some formal inquiries about Saturday's event that we need to clarify with you." Caroline set down her coffee cup, switching automatically into professional problem-solving mode. "What kind of inquiries?" she asked, already mentally reviewing the vendor contracts and payment schedules that Wesley had handled with his characteristic obsessive attention to detail. "Legal inquiries," the coordinator replied, "from an attorney representing Mr. Wesley Pearson. They're requesting confirmation of his status as the event guarantor and asking about any changes to his responsibilities that weren't reflected in the original documentation." The words hit Caroline like ice water. Wesley had contacted a lawyer. Wesley, who spent 20 minutes researching paint brands before buying a gallon of primer, who checked building codes twice before installing a simple shelf, had somehow managed to retain legal counsel within 48 hours of being turned away from the wedding. It was so completely unlike him that Caroline's first impulse was to assume some kind of misunderstanding. Her phone buzzed with another incoming call, the caterer, then another buzz, an email, a notification from the florist's accounting department. The pattern became horrifyingly clear as the morning progressed. Every vendor associated with the wedding was receiving formal requests for documentation about contracts, guarantor status, and liability arrangements, all from Rebecca Cross, attorney at law, representing the interests of Wesley Pearson in matters related to event contract, RC 2024-00847. Caroline had underestimated him completely. She'd assumed his retreat from the wedding entrance was typical Wesley behavior, quiet acceptance of his place in the social hierarchy, dignified withdrawal to avoid complications. Instead, he had apparently spent the weekend building a legal case with the same methodical precision he brought to construction projects. Measure twice, cut once, as he always said. The realization was simultaneously infuriating and oddly impressive. For 16 years, she'd managed Wesley like she managed difficult real estate clients, with careful positioning, strategic information and control, and just enough acknowledgement of his contributions to keep him cooperative. She'd never considered that his legendary attention to detail might extend to documenting his own systematic exclusion from family events. When Natalie called from her honeymoon that afternoon, her voice carried a confusion that made Caroline's stomach tighten. "Mom, Marshall's dad got a weird email about the wedding contracts. Something about liability and guarantor status. Vincent's asking if there are any legal issues with the venue that might affect insurance coverage for the reception." This was the nightmare scenario Caroline had never seen coming. The Colemans weren't just wealthy, they were lawsuit-cautious wealthy, the kind of family that maintained relationships with law firms the way other people maintained relationships with dry cleaners. If they sensed any legal complications associated with their son's wedding, they would pursue absolute clarity, with the kind of ruthless thoroughness that had built their tech fortune. "It's probably just Wesley being Wesley," Caroline said, injecting her voice with the exasperated affection she'd perfected over years of making excuses for her husband's quirks. "You know how he is about paperwork. I'm sure it's just some misunderstanding about vendor payments." But even as she spoke, Caroline could feel the careful architecture of Saturday night beginning to shift. The elegant evening she'd orchestrated, where she'd moved through the Coleman social circle as exactly the kind of sophisticated woman she'd always intended to be, was now shadowed by legal inquiries that highlighted rather than concealed Wesley's role as the event's financial guarantor. The irony was becoming painfully apparent. In her rush to present herself as elegantly self-sufficient, she'd conveniently overlooked the fact that every elegant detail of Natalie's wedding bore Wesley's signature on its underlying documentation. The venue contract, the insurance policy, the catering agreement, even the musician's liability waiver, all meticulously executed by a man whose primary professional qualification was understanding exactly what happened when people didn't pay attention to fine print. By Tuesday, the situation had escalated beyond Caroline's ability to manage through her usual combination of charm and strategic omission. Vincent Coleman called her directly, his voice carrying the particular chill that successful executives used when discussing potential legal exposure. "Caroline, I need to understand exactly what's happening with these contract inquiries. Jennifer and I are uncomfortable with any ambiguity about liability coverage for events our family attends." The conversation that followed was perhaps the most professionally humiliating of Caroline's career, explaining that her husband, the husband she'd effectively written out of the wedding narrative, was actually the legal guarantor for every aspect of the celebration, required admitting to a level of deception that no amount of social grace could completely smooth over. "So, Mr. Pearson was financially responsible for the entire event?" Vincent asked, his tone suggesting he was already calculating potential complications. "But wasn't present at the celebration itself?" Caroline found herself in the impossible position of explaining Wesley's absence without admitting to the deliberate nature of his exclusion. "It was a misunderstanding about the guest list," she said weakly. "A clerical error that we didn't catch in time." The silence that followed was longer than Vincent's usual business pauses, the kind of silence that preceded expensive decisions about risk management and relationship boundaries. Caroline realized with growing horror that Wesley's methodical legal inquiry wasn't just threatening her carefully constructed social elevation. It was systematically dismantling it, one contract at a time. The unraveling accelerated with the precision of a controlled demolition. By Wednesday, Caroline's carefully orchestrated world was receiving structural damage assessments from multiple directions, each one more devastating than the last. Wesley's attorney had apparently inherited his client's methodical approach to documentation, because every inquiry arrived with the kind of thorough legal precision that left no room for Caroline's usual elegant evasions. Rebecca Cross had done her homework. The letters arriving at vendor offices weren't emotional appeals or accusatory demands. They were surgical requests for clarification that highlighted every discrepancy between Wesley's contractual responsibilities and his treatment at the actual event. The venue coordinator received a request to confirm whether guarantors were typically included in guest lists. The insurance company was asked to clarify whether liability coverage remained valid when responsible parties were denied. Access to insured events. Each inquiry was phrased with the kind of professional restraint that made denial impossible while making the underlying implications absolutely clear. Someone with legal authority over the event had been systematically excluded from participating in it. The questions didn't need to be accusatory. They simply needed to be asked. Caroline's real estate instincts, honed by years of navigating complex negotiations, told her that Wesley's strategy was devastatingly effective precisely because it avoided direct confrontation. He wasn't threatening lawsuits or demanding compensation. He was simply asking for truth in a format that made lies legally problematic. The same methodical approach he brought to reading building codes was now being applied to reading the social contract Caroline had unilaterally rewritten. The phone call from Jennifer Coleman came Thursday afternoon, just as Caroline was showing a property to potential clients from Newport Beach. The conversation she'd been dreading, delivered with the kind of polite directness that wealthy women used when distance was being established. "Caroline, Vincent and I have been discussing the situation with your husband and the wedding documentation," Jennifer began, her tone carrying the chill of country club committee meetings, where memberships were quietly revoked. "We're concerned about the implications for our family's association with events where there are unresolved legal questions about guarantor treatment." Caroline stepped away from her clients, moving toward the kitchen where she could speak more privately. "Jennifer, I understand your concern, but this is really just a misunderstanding that got blown out of proportion. Wesley's always been particular about paperwork details." "That's exactly what concerns us," Jennifer replied. "If Mr. Pearson was particular enough to retain legal counsel within days of the wedding, then presumably his concerns have some foundation." Vincent's attorney reviewed the inquiry letters, and they're quite professionally constructed. This isn't the work of someone who's simply being difficult. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but Caroline could hear the conclusion being reached even as pleasantries were maintained. The Colemans had built their fortune on risk assessment, and Wesley's methodical legal inquiry represented exactly the kind of unpredictable variable they avoided in their business and social relationships. The charity committee position Jennifer had mentioned so enthusiastically on Saturday night was no longer being offered with the same enthusiasm. By Friday, Caroline realized that Wesley's quiet revenge was more sophisticated than anything she'd given him credit for. He hadn't attacked her directly or made dramatic accusations about her behavior. Instead, he'd simply forced everyone involved to acknowledge the truth about his role in the wedding, which made her deception impossible to maintain without looking deliberately dishonest. The vendor contracts told a story that contradicted the elegant narrative Caroline had constructed about her self-sufficient family's situation. Every document bore Wesley's signature as the responsible party. Every insurance policy listed his liability. Every guarantee carried his professional credentials. The legal paper trail revealed him not as a peripheral figure in Natalie's life, but as the financial foundation that had made the entire celebration possible. Worse, his systematic exclusion from an event he'd legally guaranteed exposed Caroline's management of the situation as something more calculated than a simple oversight. The guest list revision, the careful omission of his name from family introductions, the suggestion that he used the service entrance, all of it looked increasingly deliberate when examined alongside the contracts that proved his central financial role. Natalie's call from her honeymoon that evening carried a different tone than their previous conversations. The confusion had sharpened into something that sounded uncomfortably like disappointment. "Mom, I've been thinking about what happened with Wes at the wedding. Marshall's been asking questions about why the man who paid for everything wasn't allowed inside. I don't have good answers." Caroline felt the conversation shift into territory she'd been hoping to avoid. "Natalie, it was a complex situation with the guest list logistics. You know how these events can get complicated with family dynamics." "But he's not complicated, Mom," Natalie replied, and Caroline heard something new in her daughter's voice, a clarity that suggested she was reevaluating more than just the wedding arrangements. Wes has been nothing but supportive for 13 years. He paid for my college, he fixed my car when I was broke, he walked me through FAFSA applications when neither of us understood them. The only complicated thing about Saturday was his name somehow disappearing from a list he should have been at the top of. The silence that followed felt like the sound of carefully constructed narratives collapsing. Caroline realized that Wesley's methodical legal approach had accomplished something her social maneuvering had never managed. It had forced everyone to examine the actual facts of his relationship with their family rather than the version she'd been presenting for years. "I think Marshall and I should have dinner with Wes when we get back," Natalie continued. "I think I owe him an apology and an explanation. And I think I need to understand how someone who's been taking care of our family for 13 years ended up standing outside our celebration." Caroline ended the call with the growing certainty that Wesley's revenge was far from over. The systematic destruction of Caroline's carefully constructed elevation reached its inevitable conclusion over the following month, delivered with the same methodical precision that Wesley brought to every project he had ever completed. Each piece of her social architecture crumbled, according to a timeline that felt both gradual and inexorable, like watching a building demolition proceed according to engineering calculations rather than explosive drama. The dinner between Natalie, Marshall, and Wesley happened on a Tuesday evening at a modest restaurant near Wesley's new apartment. Caroline wasn't invited, which told her everything she needed to know about where the fault lines had ultimately settled. Natalie's account of the conversation, delivered the following day with the careful neutrality of someone who'd made difficult decisions, confirmed Caroline's worst fears about the long-term consequences of her wedding day management. "He didn't want an apology," Natalie had said, her voice carrying a tone Caroline didn't recognize, something between disappointment and newfound respect. "He just wanted acknowledgement." Marshall was impressed by how he handled the whole situation, actually. Dad said Wesley could have destroyed everything if he'd wanted to, but he chose surgical precision instead. Dad? That was the word that hit Caroline hardest. Not Wes, not your stepfather, but Dad. 13 years of carefully managing Wesley's role in their family dynamic, and it took his methodical legal response to his own exclusion to finally earn him the title Caroline had spent over a decade ensuring he never quite achieved. The Coleman's social distancing was accomplished with the same professional courtesy they probably used for declining investment opportunities that no longer met their risk parameters. No dramatic confrontations, no explicit rejections, just a gradual cooling of enthusiasm, a strategic reduction in invitations, a polite but unmistakable redrawing of social boundaries. Caroline found herself excluded from events she'd assumed were now permanently accessible, relegated back to the tier of professional acquaintances rather than personal family friends. Vincent Coleman's explanation, delivered during what would be their final private conversation, carried the devastating clarity of a business decision that had been thoroughly researched and carefully considered. "Caroline, our attorney reviewed the situation and advised us that anyone capable of that level of strategic deception in family relationships represents an unacceptable risk in business or social partnerships. The methodical nature of your husband's response suggests he documented everything, which means you were probably documenting your management strategies as well. The accusation was both wrong and absolutely accurate. Caroline hadn't been documenting her social maneuvering in the legal sense, but she had been calculating every interaction, every exclusion, every strategic presentation of her family situation. Wesley's legal response had simply forced everyone to recognize that her careful management had been deliberate rather than circumstantial. More devastatingly, Vincent's assessment revealed that the very qualities Caroline had tried to distance herself from, Wesley's attention to detail, his systematic approach to problem-solving, his quiet competence, were exactly the characteristics the Colemans respected in their business and social relationships. Her husband's methodical destruction of her social elevation had inadvertently demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that serious people took seriously. The divorce proceedings unfolded with the same inevitability as everything else Wesley touched, characterized by thorough documentation and fair distribution rather than the bitter accusations Caroline had somehow expected. His attorney presented financial records that dated back 16 years, meticulously organized in folders that chronicled not just his monetary contributions, but his consistent presence at every significant moment of Natalie's life that Caroline had deemed important enough to document. Wesley moved into a duplex near his old job sites, a place with a garage where he could work on project estimates without neighbors complaining about the noise. Caroline kept the house and most of the furniture, along with the growing realization that she'd systematically undermined the most stable relationship she'd ever managed to maintain. The irony wasn't lost on her that, in trying to elevate herself beyond Wesley's blue-collar limitations, she'd discovered that his approach to relationships, methodical, reliable, authentic, was exactly what people valued most when the social performance stopped mattering. 6 months later, Caroline received a wedding invitation that felt like a final assessment of the choices she'd made. Rebecca Cross, Wesley's attorney, was getting married to a federal judge, and Wesley had been invited to the reception in recognition of his volunteer work building houses for veteran families. The invitation was addressed only to Caroline, a courtesy that felt both generous and pointed. She was being invited to witness Wesley's integration into a social circle that valued substance over presentation, where his reputation for reliable competence had earned him exactly the kind of respect she'd spent years trying to achieve through strategic management. Caroline didn't attend the wedding. Instead, she spent that Saturday evening in her perfectly appointed house, surrounded by the expensive furniture and carefully chosen artwork that had been designed to signal her sophisticated taste, understanding finally that authentic respect couldn't be managed or curated or strategically presented. It could only be earned through consistent behavior over time, which was exactly what Wesley had been doing for 16 years, while she'd been busy positioning him as someone who didn't quite belong. The cruelest revelation was that Wesley's quiet revenge had never been about punishing her for the wedding guest list exclusion. It had been about forcing everyone, including herself, to recognize the truth about who he actually was versus who she'd been pretending he was. In trying to erase him from her carefully constructed narrative, she'd inadvertently highlighted his genuine value in ways that her years of social management had never achieved. Sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply insisting that people see the truth, especially when the truth reveals that the person you've been diminishing is exactly the kind of person everyone actually respects.